The scent of spun sugar and wood smoke hung thick in the autumn air, a familiar perfume that defined the annual Oakhaven Fair. For Alara, 15 years old and cradling a paper cone of warm cinnamon nuts, it was the highlight of the year, a brilliant splash of color in a life painted in muted, respectable tones. She moved through the crowd with her friends, their laughter a bright, careless sound against the backdrop of the bustling town square. The fair was Oakhaven's proudest tradition, a celebration of harvest and community, where every face was known and every action was seen. Oakhaven itself was a town carved from caution, nestled in a valley so deep the sun seemed to arrive late and leave early. The mountains that cradled it were not a gateway but a wall, their forested slopes a dark, perpetual presence. The townsfolk wore their piety like a second skin, their lives governed by unspoken rules and a deep-seated fear of anything that might draw the wrong kind of attention from the world beyond the peaks. Alara, with her sun-streaked hair and a heart still unburdened by the weight of that fear, represented the town's ideal, youthful innocence preserved in amber. She watched the strongman competition, her eyes wide as the local blacksmith's son strained against the weight of a massive hammer. Her friends giggled and whispered, their cheeks flushed. Alara simply smiled, her own thoughts pure and uncomplicated. Her world was her family's small, neat house with its well-tended garden, the worn path to school, and the comforting rhythm of Sunday sermons. Her parents, always hovering at the edge of her vision, had raised her within these strict, safe boundaries, their love a constant, if sometimes smothering, presence. Yet, even amidst the fair's gaiety, subtle currents of unease threaded through the crowd. As Alara passed a group of older women selling hand-stitched quilts, their conversation hushed abruptly, their eyes darting towards her before flicking away. She caught the tail end of a whispered word, stranger, and felt a faint, inexplicable chill. There were always rumors in Oakhaven. Dark little stories passed between households about those who had strayed from the path and faced the consequences. They were tales meant to instruct and warn, and Alara had always accepted them as part of the town's fabric, never imagining they could ever apply to her. Her mother found her by the cider stall, tucking a stray strand of hair behind Alara's ear with a touch that was both tender and anxious. Her gaze swept the crowd, a silent inventory of potential threats only a parent could see. "Don't wander too far, darling," she murmured, her voice a low, worried hum beneath the fair's music. "It's getting late." Alara nodded, the cinnamon nuts suddenly tasting less sweet. For a fleeting moment, the cheerful music sounded thin and forced, and the smiling faces around her seemed like carefully painted masks. She shook the feeling off, attributing it to the crisp evening air and the exhaustion of a long day. It was just the fair, she told herself. It was just a normal life. But as the first stars pricked the violet sky above the darkening mountains, the isolation of Oakhaven felt less like a shelter and more like a lid, sealing them all in with their secrets and their silent, watchful dread. The first wave of nausea struck Alara not with drama, but with a quiet, insidious dread, washing over her one morning as she tried to stomach her mother's oatmeal. The familiar, creamy texture turned to glue in her mouth, and the world tilted on a subtle, sickening axis. She pushed the bowl away, blaming a lingering chill from the fair, but the excuse felt flimsy even to her own ears. The fatigue that followed was a different beast altogether, a leaden weight in her bones that made the walk to school feel like a mountain climb. The vibrant girl who had laughed at the fair just weeks before now moved through her days in a gray haze, her limbs heavy, her thoughts slow and syrupy. Her mother noticed the pallor first, the way the light had drained from her daughter's cheeks, leaving behind a wan, translucent quality. She noticed the half-eaten meals and the way Alara would retreat to her room after school, collapsing onto her bed as if the very act of being awake was an unbearable effort. Concern, sharp and maternal, quickly curdled into a deeper, more primal fear. Whispers in a town like Oakhaven were never just whispers. They were diagnoses. She laid a cool hand on Alara's forehead, finding no fever, only a clammy stillness that was somehow worse. The decision to visit Dr. Evans was made in the hushed, tense tones reserved for funerals and bad debts. The doctor's office, A small, sterile room attached to his house smelled of antiseptic and old wood. Alara sat on the crinkling paper of the examination table, her hands clenched in her lap, while her mother stood by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street as if expecting to see an accuser in every passing shadow. Dr. Evans, a man with kind eyes and a perpetually weary demeanor, asked gentle questions and conducted a quiet examination. His expression remained professionally neutral, but a new stillness had entered the room, a held breath. The pregnancy test was a formality, a box to be checked before he could prescribe a tonic for a simple girl's anemia. He sent them home with instructions to rest and return the next day for the result. The following 24 hours were an eternity measured in the ticking of the grandfather clock and the silent, anxious glances exchanged over the dinner table. Alara's father, a man of few words and rigid principle, had said nothing, but his jaw was a hard, tight line. When they returned to the doctor's office the next afternoon, the air was cold and heavy. Dr. Evans did not meet their eyes at first, busying himself with a file on his desk. When he finally looked up, his kind eyes were filled with a profound and unsettling pity. He delivered the news not with words of congratulations, but with a soft, devastating finality. The test was positive. The world did not shatter. It simply ceased to make sound. Alara heard the words as if from a great distance, their meaning not immediately penetrating the fog of her exhaustion. She saw her mother's hand fly to her mouth, a stifled gasp the only noise in the sudden vacuum-like silence. Then the reaction came in two distinct, brutal waves. Her mother's composure fractured into 1,000 pieces, a single, tearless sob escaping before she crumpled inwards, her shoulders shaking with the force of a grief too immense for sound. Her dreams for her daughter, for a respectable marriage and a safe life within the town's good graces, evaporated in that single, clinical pronouncement. Then came her father. The initial, stunned silence that had gripped him broke with the force of a dam collapsing. His face, usually so controlled, darkened with a storm of disbelief and a raw, scalding anger. He did not look at Alara, but at the doctor, as if he were the source of this blasphemy. His voice, when it came, was low and guttural, a sound of pure betrayal. He denied it. He called it a mistake, a lie, an impossibility for his daughter, his good, quiet girl. But beneath the fury was a foundation of terror, the understanding of what this meant. The scandal was no longer a whispered rumor about someone else's family. It was here, in this room, a stain that would not wash out. It had taken root inside his own home, and the peaceful life he had built was already beginning to splinter at its core. The news did not so much spread through Oakhaven as it seeped into the town's foundations, a slow, toxic leak that poisoned every well of conversation. It began in the hushed spaces, behind the counter of the general store, over garden fences where laundry flapped in the brisk air, in the pews before Sunday service when the organ was silent. Alara's name was rarely spoken aloud, but it hung in the air, a specter at every meal. The initial shock of her condition curdled into something darker, more voracious, as the single, damning fact of her pregnancy was no longer enough. The town, in its hunger for a villain, demanded a story. The details emerged in jagged pieces, passed along like contraband. A traveling laborer, a man with rough hands and a transient smile who had repaired several roofs after a storm, was the first name to be murmured. He had been seen talking to Alara, it was said, offering her a wildflower with a grin that was too familiar. Then came the shopkeeper's son, a lanky boy of 17 with a nervous stutter, who had allegedly walked with her on the path behind the schoolhouse one twilight. The list grew, fed by speculation, jealousy, and a collective need to assign blame. A farmer's hired hand, a visiting cousin from a neighboring town, the quiet boy who worked in the stables. The accusations multiplied until the number settled, with a kind of grim finality, on 10. 10 different men. The number was repeated with a horrified awe, a tally of corruption that defied all understanding of the girl they thought they knew. The town meeting was called not as a forum for understanding, but as an inquisition. It was held in the drafty community hall, the same space that had so recently hosted the joyful chaos of the fair. Now, The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and righteous anger. Alara was not present, but her spirit was the defendant, shackled to the chair every eye avoided. Her parents sat in the front row, their postures rigid, their faces pale masks of shame. They were islands in a sea of condemnation. One by one, men stood, their faces flushed with a mixture of outrage and fear, to deny their involvement, their voices cracking with the strain of public humiliation. The shopkeeper, a man once friendly with Alara's father, pointed a trembling finger and spoke of his son's innocence, his words laced with a venom that was meant for the girl who had supposedly led him astray. The father of the traveling laborer was not present to defend his son, who had long since moved on, and so the man became a convenient ghost, a symbol of the outside world's corrupting influence. The accusations flew, no longer whispers but public proclamations, each one layering another coat of grime upon Alara's reputation. She was no longer a pregnant girl. She was a contagion, a symbol of the moral decay the town had always feared would breach its mountains. The final, crushing blow came when Reverend Miller took the floor. He did not shout. His voice was a low, thunderous roll that silenced the room more effectively than any bell. He spoke of sin, of temptation, of the serpent in their midst. He did not name the men, focusing his fiery gaze instead on the abstract notion of the transgression. But his every word fell upon Alara's absent form. He called for a public shaming, a necessary purification for the health of the community's soul. It was then that the abstract horror crystallized into a specific, immediate fate for Alara. She was to be made an example. The meeting adjourned not with a plan, but with a verdict, and the people of Oakhaven filed out into the cold night, their faces set in lines of grim satisfaction. The scandal was no longer unfolding. It had erupted, and at its center, alone in her bedroom and feeling the weight of 1,000 accusing eyes, Alara faced the terrifying reality of her town's judgment. The verdict from the town meeting did not remain confined to the community hall. It spilled out into the damp, cold streets of Oakhaven, a living thing that fed on fear and righteousness. The outrage was not a sudden explosion but a creeping frost, hardening hearts and silencing any murmurs of sympathy before they could fully form. Overnight, the simple, neat house where Alara lived with her parents became a landmark of shame. People crossed the street to avoid walking directly past it, their eyes averted as if the very structure were contaminated. The first act of vandalism came 2 days after the meeting. Alara's father awoke to find the word, "sinner," painted in jagged, red letters across their freshly whitewashed fence. The paint dripped like blood in the morning light, a public accusation that could not be ignored or washed away easily. Later that week, rotten vegetables were hurled at their front door, splattering the wood with putrid decay. Each act was a message, a stone thrown not just at their property, but at their place in the community. They were being systematically erased, their existence rendered invisible and their name rendered foul. Alara's family became ghosts in their own town. At the general store, the line at the counter would fall silent when her mother entered, then slowly reform behind her, leaving her standing alone. The shopkeeper, who had once slipped Alara a free piece of licorice, now counted her mother's change with cold, precise movements, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. Her father's workshop, where he crafted fine furniture, saw its orders canceled one by one. The quiet hum of his saw was replaced by a heavier silence, the sound of a livelihood dying. They were pariahs, their shame considered contagious. The religious condemnation provided the moral framework for the ostracism. Reverend Miller's sermons, once gentle admonishments toward a better life, became fiery diatribes. He stood in the pulpit, his face flushed, and spoke of Jezebels and fallen women, of the urgent need to scourge the wickedness from their midst so the community could be pure again. He never said Alara's name, but he didn't need to. Every eye in the congregation flicked toward where the family sat, isolated in their usual pew, the space around them a buffer of empty wood. The calls for repentance were not offers of forgiveness, but demands for a spectacle of contrition that Alara could never perform. For Alara, the isolation was a physical cage. She was kept inside the tainted house, her world shrinking to the view from her bedroom window. She watched the other children walk to school in chattering groups, their laughter a sound from another lifetime. She saw neighbors stop to talk on the street, their easy camaraderie a painful reminder of everything she had lost. The friends who had laughed with her at the fair now hurried past her house with their heads down, as if looking at it might curse them too. She was utterly alone, a prisoner of her own body and the town's collective judgment. The rumors, once confined to the specifics of her condition, now mutated into something darker and more supernatural. Whispers of a curse began to circulate. Old Mrs. Higgins claimed her prize-winning roses had withered the night the scandal broke. A farmer insisted his best milk cow had gone dry after Alara had glanced at it weeks before. The strange fatigue that had plagued her was now reinterpreted not as a symptom of pregnancy, but as a demonic lethargy, a sign of a spiritual sickness that threatened them all. She was no longer just a fallen girl. She was a conduit for misfortune, a blight on the land. The fear was palpable, a thick miasma that made the air hard to breathe inside the house and out. The community's outrage had solidified into a wall of pure, unyielding judgment, and Alara was trapped on the wrong side, with only the silent, accusing growth in her belly for company. The life growing within Alara was no longer an abstract scandal but a relentless, physical truth. Her body, once familiar and her own, became a foreign landscape, reshaped by a force she could not control. The initial nausea had been a warning tremor. Now, the true upheaval began. Her belly swelled, a taut, hard curve that strained the seams of her dresses and altered her center of gravity, making her movements slow and deliberate. The skin over her abdomen stretched, shiny and thin, mapped with a delicate web of silvery lines that she traced with a strange mix of awe and dread in the privacy of her room. It was a rapid, almost violent expansion, far more pronounced than any pregnancy the town's gossips could recall, and it fueled their whispered theories of unnatural origins. The child, or children, though the possibility of more than one had not yet been dared, made its presence known with sharp, fluttering kicks that soon escalated into forceful jabs and rolls. These movements were not the gentle, reassuring prods described in the old wives' tales her mother no longer shared with her. They were insistent, sometimes frantic, a squirming activity that made it difficult to sleep or find a moment of peace. Alara would lie in her bed at night, her hands pressed against the shifting, living mound, feeling a profound and terrifying alienation from her own flesh. Strange, vivid dreams plagued her slumber. She dreamt of deep, lightless water and of forests where the trees had eyes, of a chorus of 10 whispering voices that harmonized into a single, wordless song that vibrated in her bones. She would wake gasping, the phantom melody lingering in her ears, the sensation of being watched clinging to her like a chill. Her world had shrunk to the confines of the house and its small, fenced yard. Venturing beyond was an exercise in public mortification. On the rare occasions she was seen, the stares were like physical blows, pity from a rare few, but mostly a corrosive blend of disgust and morbid curiosity. Women pulled their children closer, their hands a protective shield against her perceived corruption. The isolation was a constant, gnawing pressure, as heavy as the child she carried. She spent her days in a limbo of fear and waiting, her mother's silent tears and her father's averted gaze a daily reminder of the ruin she had brought upon them. It was during one of her sanctioned, twilight walks in the backyard, a desperate attempt to ease the ache in her swollen back, that a woman slipped through the garden gate. She was older, with a calm, weathered face and hands that looked capable and strong. She introduced herself as Maeve, a midwife from the next valley over, summoned by a rare, sympathetic soul in Oakhaven who feared for the girl's well-being. Maeve did not flinch from Alara's condition or offer hollow platitudes. Her eyes, the color of dark earth, held no judgment, only a quiet, assessing wisdom. She asked to feel the baby, and her touch was unlike anything Alara had experienced since the scandal began. It was neither clinical nor repulsed, but reverent. Maeve's skilled hands pressed gently, mapping the contours of Alara's belly with a practiced ease. A thoughtful frown creased her brow, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, but her voice remained steady and calm. She spoke not of sin, but of the body's strength. She told Alara of the incredible work her own flesh was doing, of the river of life flowing through her to sustain another. She called her brave. That single word, spoken without condescension, was a lifeline thrown into the abyss of Alara's despair. In the deep, quiet pools of Maeve's empathy, Alara found a moment of pure, untainted connection. It was a small thing, a stolen moment in a shadowed garden, but it was enough. As Maeve slipped back into the gathering dusk, a fragile seed of resilience took root in Alara's heart. The stigma and the fear remained, a thick fog surrounding her, but now there was a pinpoint of light within it. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the relentless, mysterious movement beneath her palm, and for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone. She was enduring, and in that endurance, she found a sliver of her own, unexpected strength. The storm broke over Oakhaven with the fury of a wrathful god, a perfect, violent mirror to the chaos unfolding inside the small, shuttered house. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled through the mountain passes, rattling the very foundations of the town. Inside, by the guttering light of oil lamps, Alara's world had narrowed to a single, searing point of agony. The contractions came not in waves, but as a continuous, grinding tectonic pressure, tearing through her slight frame with a force that felt less like creation and more like demolition. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the sweat-soaked sheets, her breaths ragged sobs that were swallowed by the thunder outside. Maeve, the midwife, was a bastion of calm in the tempest, her movements economical and sure as she murmured low, steadying words. Her presence was the only anchor Alara had. The town doctor, a reluctant and scowling figure summoned by a sense of duty that warred with his disgust, stood near the door, his bag clutched in his hand like a shield. He had not wanted to come, and his presence in the room was a cold, judgmental draft. He watched the proceedings with a clinical detachment, his lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, as if the very air in the room was tainted. The hours blurred into a single, prolonged scream of pain and effort. Alara's body was no longer her own. It was a vessel being ripped apart from the inside. Maeve's calm instructions were the only things that pierced the red haze of suffering. Then, with a final, gut-wrenching push that felt like her spine might snap, the first child was born into Maeve's waiting hands. But the moment of relief, the first cry that should have split the air, never came. The room held its breath. The baby, a boy, was unnervingly silent. He did not gasp or wail, he simply was. And his skin, in the flickering lamplight, was not the ruddy pink of a newborn, but a pale, almost silvery gray, like the underbelly of a fish. Before anyone could process this, another contraction seized Alara, even more violent than the last. The process repeated, again and again, a brutal, impossible assembly line of life. A second child, a girl, emerged with skin the deep, mottled green of moss on a shaded stone. A third, another boy, whose complexion held a faint, coppery sheen. There were more, 5 in total. 5 silent, squirming infants laid upon clean towels, their arrival as shocking and bewildering as a lightning strike. The eerie quiet was the most profound. Newborns were supposed to cry. It was the first vital sign of life, the announcement of a soul entering the world. These children made no such sound. They moved, their tiny limbs flexing, their chests rising and falling with shallow breaths, but their mouths remained closed. Their eyes, when they opened, seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it, holding a strange, ancient awareness that was utterly alien in the faces of the newly born. Maeve, for all her experience, could only stare, her capable hands hovering over the 5 strange forms, her usual composure fractured by sheer disbelief. The doctor finally stepped forward, his professional curiosity momentarily overwhelming his revulsion. He examined the firstborn, the gray-skinned boy, his fingers trembling as he checked for a heartbeat, for breath. He found both strong and steady, but the evidence of his senses could not explain what he was seeing. He looked from one child to the next, his mind scrabbling for a medical term, a known condition, anything that could categorize this aberration. He found nothing. A deep, superstitious fear, older than medicine, colder than science, settled over the room. The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if holding its breath along with the occupants. The only sounds were the sputter of the lamps and Alara's weak, exhausted whimpers. The attendants, the seasoned midwife and the trained doctor, were united in a single bewildered emotion. A primal, chilling fear. They had presided over the birth of a mystery that defied all their understanding, and the silent, strangely hued babies lying before them were not a blessing, but a terrifying omen of something they could not begin to comprehend. In the stark, unforgiving light of the following morning, the children's strangeness was no longer a collection of feverish impressions glimpsed in a storm-lashed room, but a series of chilling, undeniable facts. The 5 infants lay in a row of hastily assembled baskets, a silent, unsettling gallery of anomalies that defied every known law of biology. The initial shock of their birth had subsided, leaving behind a cold, clinical dread as Dr. Evans, his professional duty warring with a deep-seated revulsion, conducted a thorough examination. Maeve assisted, her face a mask of forced calm, but her eyes betrayed a turmoil of wonder and terror. The first child, the boy with the silvery gray skin, possessed the most immediately arresting feature. His eyes, when they opened, were not the hazy blue of most newborns, but a clear, startling silver, like liquid mercury. In the dimness of the room, they seemed to gather the scant light, emitting a faint, internal luminescence that cast tiny, shimmering reflections on his cheeks. It was not a trick of the light. The glow was inherent, a soft, ethereal radiance that pulsed in time with his quiet breaths. Dr. Evans shone a penlight into them, expecting a pupil's contraction, but the silver orbs seemed to absorb the beam, swallowing it whole without a flicker. The second, the girl with the mossy green complexion, had hands that drew a sharp, hissed intake of breath from the doctor. Her fingers were not separate digits, but were joined by a thin, delicate membrane of skin that stretched from the base to the first knuckle, creating a distinct, paddle-like appearance. The webbing was supple and seamless, a perfect biological adaptation that spoke of a different environment, a different evolutionary path entirely. It was a trait seen in certain genetic disorders, yet here it was isolated, pristine, and paired with a vitality that those conditions never afforded. It was the third child, a boy with a coppery tint to his skin, who presented the most profound psychological enigma. He never cried. Not during the examination, not when hungry, not when startled. His needs were communicated through a quiet, watchful stillness or, at most, a soft, guttural coo that was more animal than human. He simply observed the world with those dark, knowing eyes, his silence more unnerving than any infant's scream. Dr. Evans tested his reflexes, pinched the soft skin of his foot, actions that should have provoked a furious, instinctual wail. The child flinched, his face scrunching in clear displeasure, but his vocal cords remained stubbornly, impossibly mute. Theories were proposed in hushed, frantic tones, circling the children like nervous birds. The doctor spoke of chimerism, of rare genetic mosaics where 2 sets of DNA could create a patchwork of traits. He muttered about teratogens, unknown environmental toxins from the woods that might have triggered monstrous mutations. But no single theory fit. Chimerism did not explain the purposeful, almost elegant nature of the features, the functional webbing, the purposeful luminescence. Toxins caused damage, deformity, not this eerie, seemingly deliberate design. The children were not deformed. They were different, crafted by a logic that was utterly alien to human science. The mystery deepened with every passing hour, solidifying from a shocking event into a permanent, baffling reality. The doctor's medical texts offered no answers, only a growing sense of his own ignorance. Maeve's folk wisdom, a rich tapestry of herbal lore and old country remedies, was equally useless. This was beyond poultices and prayers. They were left with only the evidence of their own eyes. 5 infants who were a living, breathing contradiction, a biological riddle that whispered of origins far beyond the understanding of the isolated town of Oakhaven or the limited scope of their knowledge. The fear in the room was no longer just of scandal or social ruin. It was the profound, existential fear of the utterly unknown, made flesh and laid swaddled in a row of baskets. The arrival of the outsiders sent a new kind of tremor through Oakhaven, one distinct from the familiar rhythms of fear and superstition. They came not in the hushed, furtive manner of gossips, but with the blunt, purposeful confidence of those who believed in answers. First was Dr. Alistair Finch, a geneticist from a university several valleys away, a man whose very posture seemed to be shaped by the rigid spine of scientific inquiry. His hands, constantly shuffling through papers in a worn leather satchel, were instruments of data, not faith. Close on his heels came Anya Sharma, a paranormal investigator whose reputation was built on chasing whispers in the static of abandoned places. Her eyes, dark and perpetually scanning, missed nothing, from the wary glances of the townsfolk to the way the very light seemed to bend differently around Alara's house. They set up their respective camps in the small, reluctant space the town afforded them. Dr. Finch commandeered a back room in the doctor's office, transforming it into a makeshift lab cluttered with microscopes, centrifuges, and vials for collecting samples. His approach was one of meticulous, sterile intrusion. He sought to map the mystery, to reduce the children's strangeness to a series of quantifiable anomalies in their chromosomes and blood chemistry. Anya Sharma, meanwhile, operated from a rented room above the tavern, her equipment consisting of electromagnetic field meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders designed to capture frequencies beyond human hearing. She sought not to dissect, but to listen, to perceive the unseen energies that might be clinging to the children like static. Alara, now a young mother hardened by ostracism and fierce, protective love, regarded them both with a deep and weary suspicion. She allowed the tests, but only under her watchful, hawk-like gaze. She sat in a hard-backed chair, one of the silent, coppery-skinned boy in her arms, as Dr. Finch gently swabbed the inside of his tiny, webbed-fingered sister's cheek. She watched as he pricked the luminescent silver heel of the firstborn to draw a vial of blood that, under the microscope, revealed cells that seemed to shimmer with an impossible, internal light before the sample inexplicably degraded. The results were a cascade of frustrating inconclusives. DNA sequencing showed markers that were recognizably human, yet interspersed with sequences that were fragmented, corrupted, or simply absent from any known genetic database. Hormonal panels returned levels that fluctuated wildly for no discernible reason, defying every established baseline. Anya Sharma's investigations proved equally baffling. Her meters registered no unusual electromagnetic activity in the children's presence. Her recordings captured only the mundane sounds of the household, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of the wind. Yet, when she reviewed the footage, she would sometimes find a fleeting, dark blur at the edge of the frame, or a moment where the audio seemed to drop out entirely, leaving a perfect, unnatural silence. They were anomalies that could be dismissed as equipment glitches, but their timing, always coinciding with a subtle shift in one of the children's moods, felt too significant to ignore. She felt the mystery not in her machines, but in the prickle on her skin, in the way the air grew heavy and still when all 5 children were quiet and watching. The presence of these seekers of truth fractured the town's monolithic fear into 2 distinct, warring factions. One group, led by men like the blacksmith and the reverend, saw the outsiders as meddlers, prying open a box that was better left sealed. They whispered that the geneticist was a modern-day alchemist and the investigator a witch, and that their probing would only anger whatever dark forces had gifted the children. They wanted the family exiled, the mystery buried, and the town's fragile peace restored through willful ignorance. The other faction, comprised of the younger, more curious, and those secretly weary of the town's oppressive piety, saw hope in the outsiders. They believed science or some new understanding could explain the horror away, could sanitize it and make it safe. They argued in the tavern and the store, their voices a new, contentious hum in the once unified whisper of condemnation. Through it all, Alara remained the unmovable center, a fortress around her children. She learned to interpret the subtle signs of their discomfort, the slight dimming of the silver-eyed boy's glow when Dr. Finch's instruments came too close, the way the silent boy would turn his head away from Anya Sharma's intense gaze. She became a master of deflection, of ending a test early, of ushering the investigators out with a quiet, firm finality. She did not know what her children were, but she knew they were hers. The inconclusive results and the town's deepening schism were not her concern. Her world had shrunk to the 5 small, impossible lives in her care, and she would let no one, not a man of science nor a hunter of ghosts, scrutinize them into something to be feared or solved. They were not a problem. They were her children. The world beyond the overgrown garden fence ceased to exist for Ilara, replaced by the perpetual twilight of a life lived in deliberate seclusion. The house, once a home, had become a fortress and a prison, its windows perpetually shuttered against the prying eyes of Oakhaven. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of boiled milk, drying herbs, and the faint, metallic tang that seemed to cling to the children, a constant reminder of their otherness. Her days were a relentless cycle of survival, a silent war waged against scarcity and the ever-present threat of discovery. Supplies were a constant struggle. Trips to the edge of town for necessities were furtive, pre-dawn missions, conducted with the heart-pounding urgency of a thief, paid for with the last of her father's hidden savings left in a rusting tin. Safety was an illusion that frayed with every creak of the floorboards and every rustle in the hedgerow. Ilara's senses, honed by a year of fear, were perpetually alert. She slept in fits and starts, her ears straining for the sound of an angry mob or the telltale crunch of gravel under a stranger's boot. The children, now a year old, were a handful of quiet, unsettling energy. They did not babble or cry, but communicated through a complex language of glances, subtle shifts in their strange coloring, and a profound, unnerving silence. The boy with the silver eyes would watch her from his crib, his faint luminescence casting just enough light to navigate the dark room during midnight feedings, his gaze ancient and knowing. The girl with the webbed fingers could manipulate small objects with an impossible, spider-like delicacy, her green-tinged hands moving with a purpose that belied her infancy. It was on a morning that dawned clear and bright, the sun painting the dusty floorboards in bars of gold, that the most poignant and terrifying moment of their seclusion occurred. Ilara was in the garden, hanging worn linens on a line, savoring the unseasonable warmth. The children were scattered on a patched blanket, their strange little forms soaking in the light. The copper-skinned boy, the one who never made a sound, was sitting apart, his head tilted back, his nostrils flaring as he sampled the air. He had been unusually still all morning, his dark eyes fixed on the cloudless, cerulean sky. Suddenly, he crawled toward her with a determined urgency she had never seen in him before. He tugged at the hem of her skirt, his mute insistence pulling her from her task. When she looked down, he pointed a small, coppery finger not at anything in the garden, but at the western horizon, where the mountains formed a jagged blue line. Then he pointed firmly at the house. He repeated the gesture, his face a mask of unshakable certainty. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced Ilara's spine. There was nothing there. The sky was a flawless, empty bowl. But a mother's instinct, woven with a year of witnessing the impossible, screamed at her to listen. Driven by a dread she could not name, she gathered the children, herding their silent, compliant forms back into the dim safety of the house. She had just bolted the door when the first rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very foundations. Within minutes, the brilliant day was devoured by bruised, purple clouds. The wind rose, howling around the shuttered windows with a vengeful force. The storm that broke was a tempest of biblical fury, hurling hail the size of pebbles against the roof. The rain so dense it seemed the sky was falling in one solid sheet. Huddled in the center of the main room with her 5 children clutched to her, Ilara felt a love so fierce it was a physical pain, intertwined with a terror so profound it stole her breath. The copper-skinned boy rested his head against her chest, utterly calm, as if he had merely reminded her of a forgotten appointment. He had known. He had felt the storm's approach in the very air, had read its intention in the clear, empty sky. This was not a guess. It was a certainty, a faculty as innate to him as breathing. In that moment, Surrounded by the roaring evidence of his uncanny ability, Alara understood the true shape of her life. She was not just raising strange children. She was guarding living mysteries, each one a key to a door she was terrified to open. The wonder of his gift was eclipsed by the chilling realization of what other, greater unknowns lay dormant within them, waiting to awaken in the shadows of their sequestered world. 5 years had weathered the house at the edge of Oakhaven, wrapping it in a deeper silence and a thicker cloak of neglect. The paint peeled in long, sorrowful curls, and the garden, once her mother's pride, had surrendered to a wild, tangled profusion that served as a natural bulwark against the world. Inside, the air hummed with a quiet, concentrated energy, the sound of 5 unique minds and bodies navigating the world from the confines of their sanctuary. The infants had become toddlers, their strange traits evolving from eerie novelties into defined, unsettling abilities that shaped every moment of their sequestered lives. The boy they called Silas, whose skin still held that faint, silvery sheen, no longer merely absorbed light. His mind seemed to absorb information with the same voracious intensity. He had taught himself to read from the few, tattered books in the house, his small finger tracing the words with a focus that was unnerving in one so young. He would dismantle a broken clock and, without instruction, reassemble its intricate gears into a new, whirring configuration that told the time of a different, imaginary world. His intelligence was a quiet, humming engine in the corner of the room, solving problems Alara hadn't even known existed. His sister, Fern, with the moss-green complexion and webbed fingers, had developed a profound, physical connection to the green things of the world. She would sit for hours in the overgrown garden, not playing, but communing. One afternoon, Alara watched as Fern laid her small, paddle-like hands on the wilted stem of a sunflower that had been crushed by a fallen branch. Under her touch, the plant seemed to shudder. The broken stem straightened, the bruised leaves flushed with a vibrant, emerald health, and the drooping bud lifted its face to the sun, blooming with a golden brilliance that was out of season. It was not a frantic, magical burst, but a slow, deliberate act of persuasion, as if she were simply reminding the plant of its own inherent strength. The garden, under her silent care, thrived in a chaotic, defiant beauty that was a stark contrast to the neatly ordered plots of the town. The children's interactions with each other were a silent, intricate ballet, a language built on shared glances and unspoken understandings. They moved as a single, multifaceted organism. The silent, copper-skinned boy, whom Alara had named Kale, would place a steadying hand on Silas's shoulder when his frustration with a mechanical puzzle grew too intense, his mere presence a calming balm. Fern would bring a freshly opened flower to the one who seemed most somber, her offering a wordless comfort. They were a self-contained universe, their bond a fortress that required no words, their love for Alara a constant, warm current that flowed between them. She was the sun around which their strange, quiet world orbited. But beyond the garden fence, the world was not so kind. On the rare occasions Alara was forced to venture to the very edge of town for supplies, she would sometimes take the children, their small hands clutched tightly in hers. They were a silent, haunting procession. The other children of Oakhaven, who played boisterous games of tag and kick the can, would freeze at the sight of them. Their laughter would die in their throats, replaced by a wide-eyed, fearful silence. They did not point or taunt. Their fear was too deep, too ingrained by their parents' whispered warnings for such open mockery. Instead, they would simply watch, their games forgotten, as Alara and her children passed. A coven of small, silent ghosts. This avoidance was a different kind of wall, one built not of wood and nails, but of fear and superstition. It amplified the family's isolation, making the vibrant life of the town, the shouts from the schoolyard, the chatter from the general store, sound like a distant, unreachable country. The children of Oakhaven's rejection was a lesson taught without words, a daily reminder that they were outsiders, set apart not just by their mother's past, but by their very beings. They were growing up different, their unique natures both their greatest strength and the very thing that cemented their exile, weaving their strangeness into the fabric of their souls within the quiet, shadowed walls of their forgotten home. The unease that had simmered in Oakhaven for years finally reached a violent boil, fed by a series of inexplicable events that seemed to trail the children like a malevolent shadow. It began with Old Man Hemlock's prized dairy cow, a robust creature known for its rich milk. The children had passed its pasture on one of their rare, escorted walks along the back lanes, a silent, watchful parade. The next morning, the cow was found listless in its stall, its milk curdled and thin, its eyes glazed with a strange film. No veterinarian could find a cause, no blight or infection. Then, the Cooper family's chickens stopped laying, their coop filled with nothing but fragile, hollow-shelled eggs the day after the children had been seen near their fence. A ewe belonging to the town's seamstress gave birth to a stillborn lamb, its form twisted in a way that echoed old superstitious fears. In a town that lived and died by the health of its land and livestock, these were not coincidences. They were a pattern, a curse made manifest. The incidents were small, isolated, but in the hothouse atmosphere of Oakhaven, they cross-pollinated with decades of ingrained superstition, growing into a monstrous, unified fear. The children were no longer just strange. They were a blight, their very presence a poison that sickened the earth and its creatures. Whispers that had once been confined to kitchen tables and hushed conversations after church now spilled into the open, loud and venomous. They were called devil's spawn, changelings left by the fair folk, a corruption that would eventually taint the entire valley if not excised. The town's fear was a physical force, a cold wind that seeped under doors and stirred the curtains in every home, carrying with it the scent of coming conflict. The emergency town meeting was not called in the community hall, but in the larger, more imposing space of the church, as if to sanctify the coming judgment. The air inside was thick and hot, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and righteous anger. Every pew was packed, every face a mask of hard-lined fear and determination. Elara, against all advice and her own terror, had come. She stood at the front before the pulpit, a solitary figure with her back straight, her 5 children clustered silently behind her skirts like a living shield. Their strange eyes, silver, dark, and knowing, took in the hostile crowd without a flicker of emotion, their quietude more accusing than any scream. Reverend Miller led the charge, his voice booming from the pulpit, no longer a shepherd's call but a general's rallying cry. He spoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, of purging the wicked from the flock to save the righteous. He did not speak of exile. He spoke of salvation through banishment, framing it as a moral necessity, a divine command to cast the corruption out into the wilderness from whence it surely came. His words were met with a rumble of agreement, a forest of nodding heads and clenched fists. Then others stood, their voices cracking with fury. The blacksmith, a man whose strength was Oakhaven's legend, demanded they be driven out that very night, for the safety of their own children. The farmer who had lost his ewe wept openly, his grief weaponized into a plea for vengeance. Then Elara stepped forward. The room fell into a sudden, startled hush. Her voice, when it came, was not the timid whisper they expected, but low and clear, forged in the fires of 5 years of isolation and fierce, maternal love. She did not plead for herself, but for them. She spoke of their silence, their gentleness, their bond. She described the way Fern could make a bruised flower heal, the way Kale's calm could soothe a fevered brow, the quiet brilliance of Silas's mind. She begged them to see not monsters but children. Her words were a raw, emotional tapestry woven from desperation and love, and for a fleeting moment, they hung in the air, a fragile possibility of mercy. But the fear was too deep, the roots of superstition too strong. Her pleas were met with shouted threats and jeers. A man from the back yelled that her love was a demon's trick, that her children's gentleness was a lure. The mood turned ugly, the air crackling with the promise of violence. The community's descent into paranoia was complete. They were no longer neighbors debating a difficult issue. They were a mob unified by a shared terror, ready to sacrifice the few for the perceived safety of the many. The vote, when it was called, was a foregone conclusion, a roar of affirmation that shook the old church's foundations. The family was to be exiled by week's end, cast out beyond the mountain pass, their fate surrendered to the mercy of the wilds. As the verdict echoed around her, Alara gathered her children closer, their small, warm bodies pressing against her, a silent island in a sea of terrified, hateful faces. The town's fear had spoken, and its judgment was absolute. 20 years had not softened Oakhaven's memory. It had only polished the legend to a hard, brilliant sheen, a cautionary tale worn smooth by countless retellings. The town itself had changed, its edges blurred by a new highway that brought in tourists and satellite dishes. But its heart remained stubbornly the same, beating to the old, fearful rhythms. The house at the edge of town was a skeleton now, its roof caved in, its garden a dense thicket of brambles and memory. Yet, its ghost presided over the community, a permanent stain on the landscape. The children born within its walls were children no longer, but adults scattered like seeds on the wind, some staying close in the surrounding valleys, others fleeing as far as the roads would take them, all of them carrying the quiet weight of their origin. They had families of their own now, husbands and wives who had been drawn to their quiet strangeness or who had learned to love them in spite of it. Their homes were places of subtle, contained peculiarities. A potted plant that never wilted, a clock that kept perfect time without ever being wound, a pervasive, unshakable calm that settled over visitors. Their own children, the second generation, were for the most part ordinary, a relief that was felt as a physical unclenching of muscles held taut for decades. But the mystery had not been entirely diluted by time. Lena, the 5-year-old daughter of Fern, was the echo that proved the legend was not yet finished. She had her mother's thoughtful green eyes and a quiet demeanor, but it was her hands that told the true story. One afternoon, during a family gathering at her grandfather's farmstead just outside Oakhaven, she was chasing fireflies in the twilight. She tripped on a gnarled root, tumbling hard onto the gravel path. The wail that followed was a normal, human sound of pain, but when her mother rushed over, the deep gash on Lena's knee was not bleeding in the ordinary way. Instead, it shimmered, a faint, silvery luminescence rising from the torn flesh before the skin seemed to knit itself together from the inside out, leaving behind only a faint, glowing line that faded to a silvery scar within the hour. It was not the dramatic, instantaneous healing of folklore, but a swift, efficient, and utterly unnatural process. The family watched in a familiar, dreaded silence. The trait had not been lost. It had only lain dormant, waiting. In Oakhaven, the old townsfolk, their backs now bent and their hair gone white, were the keepers of the flame. They gathered on the sun-bleached benches outside the general store, their voices a dry rustle of leaves. They did not speak of the family with anger anymore, but with a kind of grim, proprietary awe, as if the legend belonged to them personally. They pointed out Lena's mother, Fern, when she came to town for supplies, whispering about the webbed fingers of her infancy and the garden that had defied all seasons. They recounted the story of the birth under the storm, of the 10 fathers, of the silent, strange-eyed babies, each retelling adding another layer of patina to the myth. Their stories were not told to frighten the young, but to remind them of the town's enduring, peculiar identity, a history written not in ledgers but in whispers. This legacy, this generational echo, placed an almost unbearable strain on the family ties that remained. The siblings who had chosen to stay close, bound by their shared, unspoken past, found themselves grappling with the resurgence of the very thing they had tried to outrun. Fern looked at her daughter's silvery scar not as a miracle, but as a sentence, a renewal of the isolation she had endured. It sparked arguments that were never voiced in front of the children, tense silences over supper tables where the fear of what might manifest next hung heavier than any spoken word. A cousin, married to a man from the city who knew nothing of the family's history, pleaded with her husband to move further away, terrified that her own child might one day show a sign. The family, which had once been a unified front against the world, now found itself fractured by the very mystery that had created it, the bonds of blood tested by the dread of the unknown being passed down, a cursed inheritance haunting the new generation just as it had the old. The past was not a ghost to Lena. It was a locked room, and she held the only key. As a journalist, She had built a career on picking the locks of other people's secrets, but this was different. This was personal. The story of the Oakhaven children was a family heirloom of the most terrible kind. A secret her own grandfather had taken to his grave. A shameful whisper that he had been one of the 10. For Lena, the mystery was a splinter in her soul. An itch of unanswered questions that had driven her from the city back to the town her family had fled decades before. She arrived in Oakhaven under the guise of writing a piece on isolated mountain communities. But her rented car and digital recorder were tools for a far more intimate excavation. She had come to dig up the roots of her own strange inheritance. Oakhaven greeted her with a silence that felt deliberate. The mountains still loomed. The air still carried the crisp, thin scent of pine and cold earth. But the town itself had a closed-off quality, like a book snapped shut. The people she approached, the postmaster, the woman running the diner, the old men whittling outside the shuttered hardware store, were polite but distant. Their answers to her casual questions about the town's history were rehearsed and bland, a collective amnesia that felt as solid as the surrounding peaks. When she gently steered the conversation toward the older stories, the legends from 30 years past, a subtle shift occurred. Eyes that had been merely cautious became shuttered. Conversations faltered. A woman clipping her roses simply turned her back and went inside. The town's resistance was not angry or confrontational. It was a quiet, impenetrable wall of secrecy, a practiced art of forgetting that had been perfected over a generation. Undeterred, Lena turned her attention to the elderly, the ones whose memories predated the official silence. She found them in a small, sunlit common room at the Oakhaven rest home, their faces etched with the topography of long lives. They were more willing to talk, their filters weakened by age and a desire for company, but their words were veiled and cautious. An old woman named Agnes, her hands knotted with arthritis, spoke of a great sadness that had befallen a family, but would not name them. A man named Walter recalled a strange storm, the night of the infamous birth, his eyes clouding with a superstitious dread that decades had not diminished. They offered fragments, glimpses through a frosted glass, but whenever Lena pressed for specifics, the number of children, their names, their fates, they clammed up, their gazes drifting toward the window as if expecting to see a ghost from the past standing in the garden. The secrecy was a living entity, a pact made long ago that these old souls still felt honor-bound to keep. The breakthrough came not from a person but from paper. In the dusty, neglected attic of the town's tiny historical society, a room that smelled of decaying newsprint and forgotten things, Lena found a cardboard box labeled Miscellaneous Donations, 1980 to 1990. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of faded quilting patterns, were 3 small, leather-bound diaries. They belonged to Maeve, the midwife. The script was an elegant, flowing hand, detailing the births, illnesses, and lives of Oakhaven's residents from a bygone era. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully turned the brittle pages, her reporter's instinct humming. And there it was. The entry was not dramatic, but its clinical tone made the impossible facts all the more chilling. Maeve had documented Alara's labor, the storm, the 5 silent births, the unearthly pigmentation and features of the infants beyond any medical text or folk wisdom. She described the fear in the doctor's eyes, the town's swift, cruel judgment. But it was the final paragraph of the entry that made Lena's blood run cold. Maeve had written of her own suspicions, noting that in the weeks preceding the conception, a team of government surveyors had been in the area, taking water and soil samples from the creek that ran behind Alara's house. They had been unusually secretive, she noted, and one of them had been seen talking to several of the young men of the town, including Lena's own grandfather, offering them cash for what he called routine physical assessments. Maeve had written, "I do not believe in demons or fairies. I believe in cause and effect. Something was done here. Something was introduced or taken. This was not an act of God, but of man." The words hung in the dusty attic air, a whisper from the grave. The mystery of the Oakhaven children was not just a story of scandal and superstition. It was potentially a story of a conspiracy, a hidden experiment whose echoes had shaped Lena's very bloodline, and she was now the only one listening. The past was not a dusty relic to Lena. It was a crime scene, and Maeve's diary was the first bloody fingerprint. The midwife's words transformed the family legend from a supernatural folktale into a potential case of cold, human malfeasance. The government surveyors were no longer vague figures of local lore. They were suspects. Lena's focus sharpened from a personal quest for origin to a professional hunt for evidence. She left the Historical Society with the diaries carefully wrapped in her bag, the weight of their implications settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her next stop was the County Records Office, a squat, bureaucratic building an hour's drive from Oakhaven, where the secrets of the living and the dead were filed away in endless rows of metal cabinets and microfiche reels. The air in the records office was cool and smelled of old paper and ozone from the humming microfilm readers. Lena requested everything she could find from that pivotal year: birth records, death certificates, property deeds, and most importantly, any archived medical or public health documentation. The clerk, a bored young man with headphones, brought her a stack of files and spools of film with a disinterested shrug. For hours, Lena sat in the pale green glow of the reader, her eyes straining as she scanned decades of Oakhaven's official history. She cross-referenced the names of the 10 accused men with their medical records. At first, everything appeared mundane: childhood vaccinations, a broken arm, a case of pneumonia. But then, a pattern emerged, subtle as a watermark. Each of the men, in the months leading up to Alara's pregnancy, had been treated by the same visiting physician, a Dr. Robert Vance, for what was listed as seasonal fatigue. The prescribed treatment was a vitamin booster, administered via injection. The records for these specific visits were curiously sparse, lacking the usual detail of dosage or specific compounds used. It was a common, forgettable ailment and a common, forgettable treatment, but its timing and uniformity across all 10 men was a coincidence that rang with the hollow tone of a lie. The real discovery came tucked inside a folder of decommissioned public health bulletins. It was a memo, crisp and official, from the State Department of Environmental Conservation, authorizing a long-term hydrological and geological survey of the Oakhaven Valley and its watershed. The listed purpose was benign, but the project code name, Prometheus Rising, sent a jolt through her. It was dated 6 months before Alara's conception. Attached was a faded requisition form for specialized sampling equipment from a company called Genodyne Industries, a name that, when Lena looked it up on her phone, had been dissolved in the late 1980s after a series of sealed court settlements. The pieces were not yet a picture, but they were no longer just fragments. They pointed to a deliberate, organized operation, one that had involved the town's men and the land itself. The anomalies in their backgrounds were not random. They were the scars of an experiment. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle was not in a file, but in a hospice bed 50 miles away. Walter Higgins, the old man from the rest home, had been one of the laborers on the list. His niece, one of the few in town who pitted Lena's quest, had called her. Walter was dying, his mind drifting in and out of the fog of morphine and memory, but in his lucid moments he remembered things. Lena drove through a torrential downpour to reach him, the windshield wipers beating a frantic rhythm against the storm. The hospice room was quiet, smelling of antiseptic and impending death. Walter was a wisp of a man beneath the thin blanket, his breathing a shallow rattle. He recognized her, or perhaps he recognized the determination in her eyes. His voice was a papery whisper, his words slurred but decipherable. He spoke of the men from the state of the injections. He called them vitamin shots. But he remembered the man in charge, a Dr. Vance, who had promised them a little extra cash for their cooperation, telling them it was for a study on rural health. But then his eyes grew wide with a fear that the decades had not dulled. He clutched her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "They took more than blood," he rasped. "Took vials of it. Said it was for allergies." But then the dreams started. Bad dreams. Of lights in the woods, and a hummin in the blood, he gasped, his body trembling. After the girl, after what happened, they came back. One last time. Paid us to keep quiet. Told us it was a civic duty. Said it was for the country. He fell back against the pillows, exhausted. His final words, breathed out like a secret he could no longer carry, were. They seeded us. For the harvest, then, the lucidity vanished from his eyes, replaced by the vacant stare of the heavily sedated. The key details, the true purpose of Genodyne, the nature of the substance injected, the ultimate goal of Prometheus Rising, remained locked away in files she could not access and in a dying man's fading mind. She had uncovered the outline of a cover-up, a conspiracy that used the men of Oakhaven as unwitting soil for a terrible sowing. But the full, horrifying truth of the harvest remained as elusive and enigmatic as the silver-eyed children it had produced. Lena packed her rented car in the pale, uncertain light of dawn, the ghost of Walter Higgins's final words clinging to her like the valley's chill mist. Asterisk, they seeded us. For the harvest asterisk, the phrase was a key that fit no lock, an answer that only deepened the mystery. Her investigation was over. She had the diary, the medical records, the memo with its ominous project name, and the deathbed confession. It was more than anyone else had ever uncovered, a tapestry of evidence woven from official neglect and human fear. Yet it was not enough. The truth was not a single, buried fact waiting to be exhumed. It was a phantom, its shape defined by the empty spaces between the clues. The origins of the children, her own blood relatives, remained a baffling, open case, a file that could never be officially closed because its very subject defied categorization. She drove out of Oakhaven slowly, the town receding in her rearview mirror, its clustered roofs and smoking chimneys looking like a diorama of a place that had chosen to stop in time. The mountains that had once felt like walls now seemed like silent guardians of a secret they would never surrender. She had names: Dr. Robert Vance, Genodyne Industries, Prometheus Rising, but they were ghosts. Her searches led to dead ends, defunct corporations, and personnel records that had been scrubbed cleaner than an operating room. The conspiracy, if that's what it was, had been designed to be untraceable, its architects vanishing into the bureaucratic ether, leaving behind only the fallout. A family shattered by strangeness, a town poisoned by suspicion, and a legacy of questions that would never see an answer. Oakhaven itself was the true keeper of the enigma. The mystery had not been solved, but it had been absorbed, metabolized into the town's very identity. It was in the way a mother would still pull her child a little closer when walking past the old, collapsed house. It was in the stories told to wide-eyed grandchildren, not as horror tales, but as foundational myths, a part of local history as integral as the founding of the first church. The whispers never truly ceased. They just changed their tone, becoming a low, perpetual hum in the background of daily life, a reminder that the world was stranger and more unknowable than they were comfortable admitting. The community had been shaped, warped, and ultimately defined by the long-ago event, its character forged in the fires of fear and the enduring need for a story that explained the inexplicable. Lena merged onto the highway, leaving the valley behind. She carried no triumphant headline, no earth-shattering revelation. Instead, she carried the weight of the unresolved. The story of the Oakhaven children was not a puzzle to be solved, but a lens through which to view the human condition. Our capacity for love in the face of terror, our instinct to ostracize what we cannot understand, and the way a single, profound mystery can ripple through generations, altering destinies. The children, and their children, were not monsters or miracles. They were simply a fact, a permanent question mark etched into the history of a small town. And as the last of the mountain peaks disappeared from her view, Lena understood that some wonders are not meant to be dissected, and some enigmas are meant to endure, whispering their unsettling, beautiful truths through the ages, forever just beyond the grasp of understanding.